Test.
Always technical things get in the way of me doing something. Welcome everyone. Thank you all for coming over. My name is Walter Cavalieri. I'm a member of the organizing committee for this event tonight. And I have in one way or another been associated with every one of the community and national organizations which has put this panel together. My home base is the Canadian Harm Reduction Network. This forum is one of a number of community events supported by a new organization, the Canadian Drug Policy Coalition, which has been working quietly for about 2 years and is just on the verge of launching a media campaign about its existence and its purpose. There's a sign-up sheet in the back. If you want to put your names on it, we'll keep you posted about it. The Drug Policy Coalition is also supporting local events in Edmonton, Toronto, Vancouver, likely in Montreal, and in other cities. Really to stimulate discussion locally on the national drug strategy, and on drug strategy and drug policy in general. It's interesting, the Edmonton event was the first of the local events, and it had to be an underground affair because of the resistance to harm reduction. After all of these years, that's kind of unbelievable. Our local organizing team is outstanding, and I want to acknowledge all of the people on it. First of all, it was the staff of the HIV/AIDS and Legal Network, especially Sandra Chu, Patricia Allard, and Janet Butler-McPhee. Then Holly Kramer from the Toronto Harm Reduction Task Force, Cheryl Jarvis and Peter Leslie from the Human Rights Committee of the Community Justice Coalition, and Seth Clark from Passau. All of these people are here, and you can find us, you can engage us in conversation. We're very vocal. We also had a very valuable volunteer who, because of her employment, must remain anonymous. Such is life now in the big smoke. I have a bit of housekeeping to proceed to. First of all, you were handed pink cards. These are the right questions on it. When you have a question, if you raise your card, someone will come by and pick it up. And these questions will be gathered together, and some of them will be answered by the panel. Secondly, we said that we would have a drawing and give somebody a prize. Well, the drawing is going to be tomorrow, and the prize will be announced via email, so I certainly hope the person who gets the prize is here tonight. We won't know until that happens. Third, if you enjoy multitasking, you may participate in a discussion of what the panelists are saying in a live blog, which Dana Mason here in the front has set up. You can access the live blog through www.canadianharmreduction.com. That's one word. www.canadianharmreduction.com, or the hashtag #Omnibus Impacts. One word, Omnibus Impacts. So you can multitask to your right. Next, despite the cameras which you might see around, I haven't unpacked mine, it's really large. We're not going to take pictures of the audience. Some people don't like to have pictures taken, and for whatever reason, we're going to respect that. We're just going to photo the panelists. Third, after the forum is over, we're going to leave a little bit of time for network. So that's after the Q&A, at least a network. So hang out and talk with them. Network is really, really important. Finally, what you're really here for, the panel discussion of the Omnibus Crime Bill. To introduce the panelists and to keep them and us in mind, we're really fortunate to have snagged Maureen Rosenheld. You've undoubtedly heard of Maureen on the CBC, where she is a highly revered reporter and producer who has won numerous awards for her work covering health and social policy issues especially, including amongst her awards, 3 International Gabriel Awards, the B'nai Human Rights Award, the Canadian Association of Journalists Award for Investigative Reporting, and several other awards from the New York Global Festivals. As you can see, we're all in very good hands. So I'll turn you over to Maureen.
lively and informative discussion on what we now call Bill C-10, otherwise known as the Safe Streets and Communities Act. Now, first of all, there's a lot of material and information in this bill that's going to be up for discussion, so I'd like to take just a moment to explain how things will work tonight. First of all, we're going to start with a brief presentation of the bill, of what it covers and some of the elements that it contains. And then rather than formal presentations from each of the panelists, I will introduce each of them and ask each of them one question relating to the bill in their specific area. We'll then open it up to some general questions and discussion among the panelists. And as Walter mentioned, we will have cards around, bright pink index cards, and we would ask if you have questions for the panel that you'd like to have addressed, please write them on the cards. If you wish, you can put your name and your organization with it, but that's not necessary. That's entirely your choice. And if you will hand the cards back to each of the organizers, and they'll bring them up here, and we'll address each of the questions. That will be happening through the evening, so if a thought strikes you right away, just stick up your hand and we'll get a card to you. And we're hoping, as we say at the end, to leave some time for a little bit of open discussion and then some mingling, because often some of the best discussion takes place over a cup of coffee or a glass of water or a soft drink as well. So I'm going to start this evening by introducing Eugene Oscapella. Eugene is well known to many of you as a lawyer and a public policy analyst and founder of the Canadian Foundation for Drug Policy. He has appeared as a numerous expert several times before parliamentary committees. In fact, he comes to us fresh tonight from addressing the committee in Ottawa that's in fact looking at this very bill. He's worked for many years with the Law Reform Commission of Canada, and this year he was awarded the Kaiser Foundation National Award for Excellence in Public Policy, and this was for his ongoing work on drug policy reform. So I'm going to ask Eugene to start us off this evening with a brief overview of the bill.
Thank you, Maureen, and thank you to all the people who've come out. This looks like a much nicer audience than I got at the House of Commons Justice Committee this morning. I'm sure you'll be all very polite for asking incisive questions. I'd like to talk to you about the area that is most pressing for me in this bill. There are many, many concerns that people have about this bill. My particular area of knowledge is drug policy. This bill contains the fourth incarnation of a bill that was first introduced in 2007 by the Conservative government. The intention of this bill is to make our drug laws far tougher than they are right now. Now, if that were to solve our drug problems, I'd be standing up here and applauding it, but unfortunately it's going to make our drug problems considerably worse. Right now, and for about the past 15 years, we have had legislation called the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act. Under that legislation, there are no mandatory minimum penalties. And that means a judge is not compelled to sentence you to any particular term of incarceration or whatever on conviction. Before that, in the old Narcotic Control Act, the predecessor to this bill, there was a mandatory minimum provision. There was a 7-year mandatory minimum penalty for importing a narcotic into Canada. Now, cannabis is not a narcotic, but it was still caught up in that provision. So technically, you could be sentenced to 7 years in a federal penitentiary for importing one joint into Canada. That gave enormous power to the police and to prosecutors, not to judges. The Supreme Court of Canada in 1987 shot down that law and said that was excessive, it was grossly disproportionate. But it did not say that all mandatory minimum sentences were disproportionate. So what the current government has done has introduced amendments to our current drug laws that will bring mandatory minimum penalties to play in a number of circumstances. And I'll give you one. I teach a third-year criminology course at the University of Ottawa. 80% of my students are criminals under this legislation. About 10 to 20% of them would be liable to a mandatory minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary of 2 years for simply passing a tab of ecstasy at a party on a university campus. That is what this law is going to do. The law has brought in a number of mandatory minimum penalties. It has also increased the maximum penalty for production of cannabis from 7 to 14 years. One of the things that I fear most about this is that it's going to push these small, so-called generally non-violent mom-and-pop producers out of the market and pave the way for organized crime, which doesn't really care about tough sentences, to fill the void. So this is essentially what's happened. We can go into the niceties of some of these provisions, whether you get 6 months or 9 months for producing 6 plants of cannabis in a rented place. We can talk about the details of those things if people really want. The main concern is that we have taken away a very important discretion from the judges. The judges, under this law, will no longer have the capacity to determine the appropriate sentence, the appropriate minimum sentence in a case. They will be obliged to give a mandatory minimum sentence in a number of cases. And it's going to make our already overcrowded prisons even more crowded. It's going to destroy a lot more lives than even the current drug laws do. And just in case anybody's wondering, I am not pro-drug. I am pro-sensible drug policy. And there's a very, very big difference between the two. I've never even tried cannabis, which makes me probably a minority, member of a minority in my age group. Okay? So I'm not here to advocate for drugs. I'm here and many of the other people here as well are here to discuss how we can best manage the drugs that are available in our society. This bill that is introducing these mandatory minimum penalties is not going to be the way to do it. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Eugene. I think that opens up the door for some interesting discussions as we go down the line. Now, let's go to our panel for some opening questions. I'd like to start with Steve Sullivan. I'm very pleased that Steve was able to come from Ottawa to join us tonight. Steve has been an advocate for victims for more than 20 years. He's the former president of the Canadian Resource Centre for Victims of Crime, and he was the very first federal ombudsman for victims of crime, appointed by the Conservative government. He's now the executive director of Ottawa's Victims Service, and he also teaches victimology part-time at Algonquin College. Steve, let me throw the first question to you, which is, given your knowledge and your experience, how does this bill affect or address in any way the concerns of crime victims?
Well, I'm not sure that it really does very much. The one area of the bill that I know the least about is the drug bills. Is that on? Yes. Sorry. I guess just saying, I'm not sure that the bill addresses. I work at Ottawa Victim Services. We work on the front line with some of the most vulnerable victims in society, often women who are fleeing abusive relationships, women and children who have been sexually abused. I'm not sure that the bill offers much to those people. There's a number of provisions, as you can imagine, in this bill. Tougher penalties for child sex offenders, tougher to get pardons, limiting conditional sentences for a large number of offenders. There are a few provisions that I think out of a 100-page bill, maybe about 4 or 5 paragraphs that I would say as a victim advocate that I would applaud. Some enhancements of the rights for victims of the correctional system, the right to go to a parole hearing, present a statement, information about offenders and their rehabilitative efforts. And I think those are good things. Actually, they were introduced by the previous government, so there's nothing new here. For the most part, the bill is being sold as a response to the victims of crime and their needs. And I wrote down some of the things from the press releases and the minister's statements about how they're selling this bill and what I think are some of the realities. They say, for example, that this will provide support and protection for victims. The reality is that Crown attorneys are going to have less time to spend with victims. The research tells us that if we listen to victims throughout the process, we give them information about how the process works and what their role is, and we give them a voice and we actually listen to their voices and their opinions, they're more satisfied even if the sentence isn't what they thought it would be. The reality of this bill is that Crowns are going to be so much more busier that they're not going to have time to spend with victims, so their rights will actually be diminished as opposed to enhanced. They say this is a fundamental pillar of commitment to victims of crime. Those rights under the CCRA, I talked about the enhancement of those rights, which is a good thing. They're not actually putting any new dollars into the CSC Victim Services Unit. So they're spending millions and billions of dollars. None of it's going into victim services at the federal level. They say they're going to ensure justice and dignity for those who are victimized, except for those who actually don't report crimes, which we know are the majority. They're enhancing penalties for child sex offenders, which over a 2-year period will cost the federal government over $10 million. 90% of kids are never going to tell anybody. So we're leaving those kids out, and yet they're saying that they're ensuring dignity for those who are victimized. They're going to enhance justice for victims. This bill and the other bills the government has already passed will actually mean more stays, more delays, and more plea bargains because Crowns can't handle the burden they have now. I don't know how many times the Crown Attorneys Association have testified before the Justice Committee and the Senate committees and said, we can't handle the workload. We can only prosecute 10% of cases. The rest, we have to plea or we have to stay. That's what's going to happen, and that's not a victims of crime agenda. They say they're standing up for victims. I can tell you, the women we work with, who often have to make a choice between staying in an abusive relationship with their children, if they have a roof over their heads, or not knowing where they're going to spend the night because the shelters are full. This has nothing to offer those victims. And my favorite is they say victims come first. When I was Ombudsman, we recommended the federal government create a fund to help communities build child advocacy centers. These are a model in the US that actually help heal the minds and hearts of children who've been abused. They're actually spending 5 times more money on punishing sex offenders than they are for the victims, the child victims. They're spending $5 million over 5 years for child advocacy centers and $10 million over 2 years to punish sex offenders. The evidence of these advocacy centers is so overwhelming in what it can do to help these kids. Yet the priority of this government isn't those children, but is punishing their offenders. And the minister often talks about when someone challenges him on the cost of this bill, because it will be costly, not just to the federal government, but to the provincial governments. And you and I, there's only one of us, only one taxpayer. He often brings up the fact, and it's an actual true fact, that the majority of the costs of crime are actually borne by crime victims. Right? It's $83 billion. The majority of that is borne by crime victims. It's a true fact. The reality is this bill doesn't address any of that. It's not going to relieve the burden on crime victims. He also will bring up the fact when someone says the crime rates are falling, well, he'll say, but if you look at the unreported crime, fewer victims are reporting crimes. It's true. And we don't know why that is. We see a trend. We don't know why that is. There's nothing in this bill that's going to address that. There's nothing in this bill that's going to help kids come forward. Nothing in this bill that's going to give women the incentive or the ability to leave abusive relationships. But they bring up these facts about victims of crime and try to sell it that way. And what's frustrating as an advocate for victims is that they're using victims to justify an ideological agenda that will do nothing for victims in the end.
Thank you, Steve. I think he raises a lot of interesting things, and I'm sure we'll have an opportunity over the next hour or so to delve into some of those issues as well. I'd like to turn now to one of our other panelists and introduce you to Caleb Chepstick. He is the Executive Director of Canadian Students for Sensible Drug Policy, based in Ottawa, and it aims to promote young people and give them a voice in drug policy discussions and decisions. So Caleb, from your perspective, what is the impact of this legislation as you see it on some of the young people you work with?
Thank you, and thanks to the organizers for putting this event together, for all the panelists for being here, and for all of you for being here. The impacts on young people will be grand and varied, and when we say young people, it's important to recognize that young people have different experiences from the communities and cultures and contexts that they're coming in, and the way that the way the drug laws are enforced currently, and how this will likely be exacerbated through these policies. But that said, we can look at some general trends, and that enforcement-driven policy does not affect the availability of drugs, or particularly illegal drugs on the street. It does not affect the willingness or desire of young people to use those drugs and who have access to those drugs. So I mean, we have plenty of historical evidence to show that this won't affect rates of drug use or availability, which is something the government talks about, which won't happen. And then it gets into the clauses of the bill, and there are clauses of the bill who aim directly at what they say is protecting young people, but what this does is cast the net far too large. And I mean, just one example, under this bill, trafficking a pill of, or sharing a pill of ecstasy, I should say, with a friend equals 2 years in a federal prison. which is terrible. And so we're going to have a lot of young people who don't have drug problems, they have drug policy problems, which is terribly unfortunate, but this is the direction we're going. I mean, enforcement is not an effective treatment strategy, it's not an effective prevention strategy, it's not an effective harm reduction strategy. What this bill does is just sink more resources into enforcement, which is ineffective, and it's not putting anything towards treatment, it's not putting anything towards prevention or effective drug education or any of these things that make real differences in young people's lives who need help when they need it. So that's general terms, but I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you, Caleb. Now, for a little bit of gender equity, we're going to go to first of our female voices on the panel. Patricia Allard is a lawyer, and she's also Deputy Director of the Canadian AIDS Legal Network. She spent very many years advocating for criminal justice and drug policy reform both in Canada and the United States, and she has a particular interest in the effects of these public policies on people with low incomes, on children, and on women of color. So Patricia, I know you've been looking at this legislation from the point of view of what you call collateral damage and the effects of the drug policies and the criminal law. How do you see this legislation affecting not just the criminals that may be caught up in it, but the families and the children who will be affected or are related to some of the folks as well?
Thank you, and thank you for everyone for coming out. This is really important. And you know why? Because you, policymakers, are causing us to embark on a race to incarcerate. And I think what is forgotten is that when we embark on a race to incarcerate, as they've done in the US, we are moving towards mass incarceration. And with that comes the collateral damages that are involved. There are several that I'm sure we'll be discussing throughout the evening. But two that I want to mention are the impact on health. So when you overcrowd prisons, drugs are available, and CSC, Corrections Services Canada, have pointed out that drugs are available in prisons. You can find people, and you do not provide harm reduction tools, you do not provide sterile injection equipment, you are moving towards a health disaster. That's an impact. That's a serious collateral damage. The other collateral damage that's significant is that, are these folks who we are incarcerating, are they single? I'm telling you, vast majority of them are parents. So what happens to the children? Have children's services been provided with the resources to meet the needs of these children who are left behind? They are also going to be serving a sentence, and we are not addressing those impacts. I think as we go through the evening, we'll discuss the far-reaching impact of this bill. We're talking about overcrowding, infringement on people's civil liberties, human rights. God only knows what the price tag is going to be at the end of the day. So, as far as I'm concerned, and I'm sure my colleagues on the panel will agree, the most sensible approach for Parliament to take is to conduct a comprehensive impact assessment of what this bill is going to do. The impact on the fiscal impact, the impact on gender, the impact on youth, the impact on families, the impact on health. And that is necessary to forecast the overall impact of what this bill is going to be. Without that, we are in big trouble. The other thing that is necessary to take a look at is, once we do assess this, perhaps this bill should be tested. And perhaps we should have a sunset clause of policymakers, because they're rushing through this. They're rushing us through this, but there's not a proper assessment involved. So there should be a sunset clause to address that. So I'd be happy to discuss this further, but to me it's sensible to make sure that we are doing the right thing. And right now, I'm not convinced.
Have raised a whole host of issues. And I remind all of you, if you do have questions as the presenters are giving their opening remarks, please raise your hand and we'll bring you a pink card and write them on, because we do want to have your input. We want to make sure we're addressing some of the issues that you want to hear and some of the concerns of this bill as well. I'd like to turn now to Krista Williams, probably the youngest member, but of our group. She comes to us from the Naked Youth Sexual Health Network. It's a North American-wide network working for and with Indigenous youth in terms of overall health and sexual health. She is a member of the Turtle Clan and the Thames First Nation here in Ontario. Krista, I think it's no secret that Aboriginal people are overrepresented in our provincial jails and federal prisons and in our justice system generally. In your analysis and your look at this bill so far, how do you see this bill affecting Aboriginal people?
Great, thanks. I want to say Wana Bojo, everyone, and it's a great honor to be sitting here with some really awesome minds and with all of you tonight as well. So we much for that. I guess as a youth myself and as the network, we definitely do work for and by Indigenous youth, and so what that means is that that's our primary concern. And what we're seeing, particularly with this bill, is while we're not named in the bill per se, as Aboriginal youth and people, we are being specifically targeted by this bill. Our communities and our people are going to be hit the hardest. We're already, and it's interesting that we use the words overrepresented, and certainly I use that terminology as well, because there's no talk of how we got to that representation point in the first place. As far as I'm concerned, we shouldn't be represented in these populations to begin with, right? So, and that goes for lots of communities that are also affected by this. And so what I'm saying is that we already have 1 in 3 women who are inmates in federal penitentiaries are Aboriginal. We're seeing 1 in 5. Sorry, I'm not good with numbers. I'm an arts degree person. And also you're all very, very good looking tonight, so it's distracting. We're seeing 1 in 5 people in federal prisons being Aboriginal. We're seeing 1 in 4 in provincial custody, and so we're just like, we're all there. And it's getting to a breaking point. I think one of the biggest things that I want to focus on tonight, and there's so much in this bill that is really going to do damage to the work that our communities have been doing for many, many years, try and support our community members that are inside and affected by interactions with the criminal justice system. And this bill's really going to undo a lot of that work. So there's so much to discuss, and I feel like, this is the beginning of a larger discussion, but particularly talking about the Supreme Court decision that came down about 10 years ago. It's now called Gladu. And what that said was that when a judge is facing sentencing with an Aboriginal person, they have to take into account historical context, they have to take into account the current systemic injustices that we face simply because of who we are. And it's interesting that we're in a church tonight, because that's particularly talking about residential school survivors who learn really negative, really hard behaviors and violent behaviors from being part of this system that was imposed by the government and are now kind of living the consequences as we're seeing in our communities. So it's interesting that the effects and the original intention are coming from the same place, and we've been trying to deal with this for a very long time in our own ways. So what Gladu said was, okay, you have to take into account context, you have to take into account historical and current injustices. So what this bill is actually trying to do is take that away, take away our rights in terms of saying to the court, there's been a lot of damage done now and in the past, and that needs to be recognized when we're talking about sentencing, particularly when we're talking about trying to avoid incarceration, which is not, it doesn't support anybody who has interactions with the criminal justice system. It doesn't address root problems of violence and where that comes from. So when we're seeing restorative justice programs, rehabilitation, treatment programs that are being specifically designed for Aboriginal people, now we're not going to have access to those programs through conditional sentencing and Gladu Court, which is a direct target on our communities.
I just wait for my little green light. Whoops, I think one of them is... Little green light? Ah, there we go. a very distinct and different perspective, but a very important one as well. Greg Simmons comes to us with, I think what's commonly being called now, lived experience. He's a former federal inmate who spent 14 years in the system. He's now in university studying psychology and sociology, and he's also an advocate for prisoners' rights, and he works with at-risk youth. Greg, it's no secret that this bill calls for tougher sentences and longer sentences. But the system was also set up to be designed to rehabilitate people, to put them in there, but hopefully have them come out being better people. What, from your reading of this bill, does this bill address from the point of view of the kind of efforts at rehabilitation? What do you see in terms of rehabilitation in this bill?
Nothing. What I see from this bill is it's kind of scary, and it should be scary. You know, that people that are involved in crime will lose hope. Once you lose hope, you take no chances. You don't care about what you do to people, what you do to yourself. So in that end, then there's becoming more victims, category 1 offenses, which are violent offenses, robbery, assault, aggravated assault, attempted murders, whatnot. It's gonna create more, how can I say this? People are gonna buy more guns to be involved in their crimes because they're gonna be sentenced to an extraordinary amount of time. You know, I can remember when I was doing my thing, there was points in time where, you know, well, if I'm going in, I might as well go in with a gusto. You know, I don't know if you've ever seen it in movies or you've heard from people that, you know, clients or whatnot, that I'm not going to prison, I'm never letting them take me back. Well, this bill creates that mindset even further. And it, you know, like you look at the states, they're stopping it. It hasn't worked. The crime rates went up. The victim rates went up. You know, I can't think of anything more harmful to society than this bill, really, because it doesn't deal with why people are going to prisons. It doesn't, as we heard from this gentleman here, you know, it doesn't give more money to victims. All it deals with is stimulate the economy. Build more prisons. Hire more guards. Well, unfortunately, you know, you can go in for 5, 10 years, but you get out. We come back to your communities. Now, if we haven't had any programming, have we changed? No. You know, the next time we go in, our crimes could be worse. That's what scares me about this bill. You know, and when I heard that about unreported crimes, yes, there is unreported crimes, but you know, this is going to create more gangs, and gangs create more unreported crimes. There was a study done in the States. This is going to create more, I could say, victims of health problems, because as this lady said that, you know, prisoners are involved in relationships. Or if they're not involved in relationships, when they get out, they get involved in relationships, whatever gender it is. And, you know, if we're not dealing with the issues why they got there, they continue to use drugs or they continue to use alcohol and, you know, don't practice safe sex or, you know, harm reduction and whatnot. You know, there's going to be more affected people. And then that leads to the cost for health care to skyrocket even more. So it's, you know, like I said, it's really scary to me, and I hope that some common sense comes into this, and and we get away from retributive justice, where the minorities seem to pay the price the most.
Thank you, Greg, and I'm sure we'll be calling on you for more of that perspective. Because I think that's one that we don't hear a lot about, and it's a good opportunity to hear from you tonight. Eugene, I'd like to come back to you again, and one of the things in this bill, and as you mentioned, is the increase and the call for more mandatory minimum sentences for certain crimes. The government says this is a way of deterring criminals, but is there any evidence, and can you talk a little bit about what evidentiary research or proof there is that this will be an approach that's going to in fact yield positive results?
Well, if you go to the Department of Justice website, if they still have the information up on there, there have been 2 studies done by the Department of Justice in the past decade or so, both of which that have concluded that mandatory minimum penalties aren't particularly useful. They don't work. The evidence seems to go all the other way, that mandatory minimum penalties will do no good whatsoever. What they're going to do is overcrowd the system. I keep looking for evidence that mandatory minimums work, and it just doesn't seem to be there. This is a government that's very much driven by ideology, a very punitive ideology. And for some reason, they're following an American approach. The United States has had mandatory minimum penalties for many years, or particularly for drug crimes, many other crimes as well. The United States now incarcerates 2.3 million people. Now, in comparison, in Canada, we incarcerate about 35,000 somewhere. It's increasing now under the new legislation. But even on a per capita basis, the United States is way out in front. The United States incarcerates 1/4 of all the human beings imprisoned on Earth. Much of that is due to mandatory minimum penalties. And a significant part of those 2.3 million people, about 500,000 plus, are in there for drug crimes. Many of them mandatory minimum sentences. Do they work? Drugs are readily available in the United States. Rates of use they fluctuate up and down over time as they do in this country. There's no good evidence that mandatory minimum penalties actually solve the problems that they're touted as being capable of solving. What they do is impose enormous costs on our justice system. And I said this to the senators, to the House of Commons Committee this morning, and I think it's worth reminding people, this is the 21st century. There has to be a better way to resolve the social problems we face in this country than locking people up in cages. Because we may call it a correctional system, we may call it treatment rehabilitation, but it's still cages. And we really need to look at a better way. There's a better model for dealing with things. Throwing people away for longer and longer periods of time is not the way to do it.
Thank you, Eugene. That now brings us to opening up some of the questions around, and I see some of our organizers are gathering up some of those questions, so please do, and we'll bring them up to the front and start going. But I'd just like to follow up on something Eugene was just saying now about looking at a better way. One of the things we've heard from government over the last few years is this concept of restorative justice. There have been initiatives funded by the federal government in this. It's an approach that looks at working with victims and offenders and the community at large to hold offenders accountable for their actions. And I'm wondering, Steve, can you maybe address this and see if you can tell us what role restorative justice plays in this new legislation?
I hate to be negative as well, but probably not very much. Restorative justice is really, this is one of the things we teach at Algonquin, is it gets talked about as a diversion program. Restorative justice is not a program, it's a way of thinking about harm, it's a way of thinking about crime that holds the offender accountable to his victim, his or her victim, and tries to be accountable for the harm caused. So it's not about what law was broken, what we can prove and what the punishment is. It's really about trying to identify what the victim's needs are and if the offender or the wrongdoer can address that. It's supposed to, when it works well, bring in the community, the victim, and the offender. And I have to tell you, in the past, I wasn't a real big fan of restorative justice. I think like a lot of victim advocates thought it was really offender-focused. It was really just sort of soft on crime. And, what changed my mind is what I'm trying to tell politicians to do these days is really listen to the voices of victims. And I listen to some people who've been through these experiences, these other dialogues or mediation with those who would cause them so much harm. A woman whose mother and sister had died in an arson case. A woman who had suffered the most tremendous and violent incest by her father went through this, and I listened to her experience. What convinced me was I had never heard, even when the justice system in cases I knew of worked well, right? So they caught the guy, they prosecuted the guy, and he got a sentence that the victim thought was fair. I had never heard any of those victims talk about the healing that the victims who went through restorative justice talked about. Not just satisfaction that he was held accountable, but actual healing. Some of them forgave, some of them didn't. It's not about forgiveness, it's not about any sort of ideology. It's really about two people, I think, exploring what has happened and how one person can make up for that. And there's nothing in the bill that really addresses that. In Ottawa, we have a program which sadly is very underfunded, which for serious crimes, not domestic or sexual assault, but for serious crimes, if the victim is willing and the accused is willing, after the accused has taken responsibility for his offense, they can have a dialogue. And if they work out an arrangement, that can go to the sentencing judge. The problem with a lot of the provisions in this bill is there's a mandatory minimum penalty, so there's not really much point in actually having the victim pretend that they have a voice in the process, or the offender to pretend that he can actually do anything because the outcome has already been resolved. I think the government talks about supporting restorative justice, and I'm sure they spend, a small iota of money on different programs. It really does offer, I think, both those who have offended a chance to be accountable for their crimes in a way that just being sent to prison never would actually do. And it offers victims a chance to really heal. It's not for every case, it's not for every victim, it's not for every offender. But when it works, it's pretty amazing.
I really want to point out that Indigenous communities on this land have been practicing what we're now calling restorative justice since before everybody else got here. So yes, it's looking forward, yes, it's looking to the future for new solutions, but really this is something that we've been doing for a long time, and I really want to stress that is where restorative justice comes from, is our communities and our ways of knowing and understanding how to live as community.
Steve, I noticed you nodding through that a little bit. Do you want to reflect on that in some ways, on how restorative justice approach might be different if it was practiced from your perspective? Oh, sorry, Greg, I'm sorry. My apologies. Sorry. Senior moment.
Hello. Yeah, I think it does work in the sense that, especially I feel, I don't know about before sentencing, I don't know how much, how can I say it, I'm not talking about the Aboriginal community here, but how much truth goes into it from the criminal's perspective. Like for the victim, I think it's a great concept. But I definitely think that this should be something that's done before one parole hearings. If, again, both are willing. I think that's what's missing from this bill, and I know you said that the healing for victims, and I think that's so tremendous. But also, if a criminal's going to stop his patterns, they have to heal too. And I think restorative justice allows them to heal in the sense that they can, one, hopefully forgive themselves and move on. And you know, like, and I've seen it actually, like within prison, within the Aboriginal community, that them using it amongst themselves within the population when incidents happen between them. And it was amazing to see that it wasn't forced on anybody, and that two people walked away from, and I'll just say there was a death involved, that two people walked away from it, what I could say is being whole. And that's what I think restorative justice would at least attempt to do, allow people to walk away from maybe a horrible crime somewhat whole.
Not quite trusting the other one yet, so I'll stick with this one, the tried and true. I'd like to maybe call upon some of our youthful members here tonight. One of the things that we see, we hear a lot of in crime reports and the media every day is the increasing amount of violent crime committed by young people. The government is saying this bill is an attempt to crack down on that, to crack down on youth violence, to crack down on youth crime, to make young people much more accountable for the crimes they commit. What's wrong with that? Yellow?
So, I mean, the biggest piece of what's wrong with this when the government talks about it is this is largely the smokescreen they're using to justify this bill, is this fear that can be built up through media reports on selected cases. But what has to be understood that there's very little in the system currently, and there's nothing in the bill that's going to come forward that promotes any sensible methods that would promote accountability, that would promote rehabilitation, or these other things that we've touched on. And so it's part of this bill has just been a lot of spin, and this is constantly brought up in its attempt to really divert attention away from the fact that there is no evidence supporting any of this bill in the first place, whether it be its effect on drug crimes or whether it be its effect on violent crimes. There's nothing that justifies the huge expenditure of not only money, but also what will happen to people's lives. So, but I'll leave Krista if she wants to add.
I mean, I have to say, if we were at all interested in actually supporting the needs of youth, and particularly Aboriginal youth, this would not be the way that we were going to do it. And I have to remind people too that up until the 1950s, it was illegal for 3 Native people to be together in a public place. You could be incarcerated for that. And so when we're seeing kind of this reemergence of like groups of Native youth being considered gangs and therefore being arrested, I have to wonder if we're going back to this kind of racist legislation. Also a reminder that, you know, there's tons of efforts being put into this bill, yet when we see rural, remote, and northern communities, you know, asking and demanding that education be funded, that they rebuild, you know, the broken schools that are in our communities, and they get criminalized and arrested for trying to get the attention that they need to say, like, our school's broken, could you maybe help us build that again? And it's this very contradictory way of actually addressing the needs of our communities.
Now we get to some of the good questions from you. So this one is actually addressed to you, Patricia. It says, thank you for your perspective. You mentioned the idea of a sunset clause. Could you please describe what that is, how it would apply to this bill, and whether it has been implemented in previous crime bills?
Great question. I've been toying with the idea of the sunset clause and asking different folks about it. Essentially what it does is you put a particular time at which the provision or the whole act expires. It has been used in the States, it's been used here in the anti-crime bill, it's been used in other domestic bills that we've dealt with. I think the idea behind that is when you're dealing with some provisions or a whole act that is going to have such far-reaching implications both on the public purse, also on communities, Aboriginal communities, racialized communities, the health consequences, and God only knows what the collateral damages will be around that. There's a need to actually have a moment in which policymakers will look back and see, oh, did this bill actually meet our objectives of targeting organized crime? Let's hold them accountable to show us, if this bill goes through, to make sure that they actually show us that it actually does the job. Chances are pretty good that it won't do the job, and we will see the negative impacts of this bill. And I think that's the importance of the sunset clause. It's about accountability. The government needs to be held accountable, especially when we are going to be investing so much money. We have the example of the South. My colleagues in the US are now looking back and going, perhaps the war on drug is a failure. And I'm not talking about Democrats, I'm also talking about Republicans saying that. Texas is rolling back mandatory minimums. Michigan is rolling back mandatory. New York, the list goes on and on. Let's take a look at that and make sure that we're doing the right thing. And I think the sunset clause essentially makes sure that we are being sensible about what we're doing around criminal justice in this nation.
Who benefits from the legislation? I give a 3-hour lecture to my class on profiteers and prohibition. Many organizations profit from the use of the criminal law to prohibit drugs. They profit from it. Police departments get big budgets out of it. The private prison industry in the United States houses about 1/4 of all the 2.3 million prisoners held in prison there. That's prisons for profit. They make money by keeping their fellow citizens in cages, and then of course they rent out their services to data processing companies and airlines so they can do reservation work and things like this for $7 or $8 or $10 a day. Many groups profit from the current system. The politicians I was testifying before this morning also profit from the current system. They get their jobs by promising to be tough on drugs. Even if the drug laws do tremendous harm to society as a whole, there are specific groups within society that do benefit from it. And you can bet your bottom dollar that the private prisons industry in the United States is going to be moving into Canada to help run some of the prisons that will need to build and operate as a result of these drug laws. So, yes, in short, there's lots of people who profit from the current system. Now, you're never going to get the police official standing up and saying, we love prohibition, we love the current drug laws because we get big budgets out of it. They don't say that. They say, look, we need tough drug laws so we can help keep drugs away from children and young people. Well, the drug laws don't do that. And let's look at the obvious too, organized crime. The RCMP for decades now has been saying that the biggest source of funding for criminal organizations in Canada is the drug trade. It's the illegal drug. Organized crime loves prohibition. The police love prohibition. Why are these two groups on the same side of the issue?
Doesn't believe in statistics. How do we get to them? And then related to that, can anyone on the panel tell us what is happening concerning the dramatic changes in the prisons in Texas with the drug judges and the drug courts? And related to that, in light of the Globe and Mail article today denouncing this bill by the state of Texas, what impact would any of this have on the government? Who wants to tackle that?
First, I wanted to also go back to Greg's point in terms of what's going on in prisons, and I think there's a particular provision within the bill that is going to open up the possibility that the government can become more restrictive in what people can access in terms of services. But first, I think it's important to note that the government has been responsible in saying we need to increase the number of prison cells, because obviously we're going to have a serious overcrowding situation. But still, the problem is, what about the services, the needs of people who are incarcerated, the needs to ensure that there are prison visits for children of the incarcerated? That's not being addressed. So when we're looking at services within prisons, that will not be meeting the overpopulation of the prison. That is significant. And I think what we're seeing also is that within the provision of the bill, certain provisions of the bill will enable the government to get significantly minimum. In terms of Texas and drug treatment courts, I mean, we do talk about drug treatment courts here in this bill. And I think that is one step in the right direction in terms of looking at alternatives. Several pieces come up. One, are there enough drug treatment courts to meet the needs of people? Obviously, people in rural communities will not have access to that. I think the other piece is, in order to access drug treatment, you have to plead guilty. If you actually believe in your innocence, and many people do, you won't get access to drug treatment. So I just put this out to you. I think fundamentally there's a problem with this situation, and it may interfere with certain constitutional rights, specifically the right to life, security of the person under Section 7 of the Charter. So I think that's significant. Obviously, the situation in terms of drug treatment courts in the U.S. is very different, but I think what is resonating across borders is that it has a coercive nature. And it's compelling people. You have to choose between your liberty or drug treatment. What about accessing drug treatment before even coming in contact with the criminal justice system? What about that? Shouldn't we be investing more on the front end rather than forcing people to go through the criminal justice system or get involved in it before you actually get access to treatment? I think that's significant, and I know that our colleagues in the South are really pushing to make sure that we focus on a health framework rather than a criminal framework, a prohibition framework. And so that, to me, is a significant piece.
Awesome. I'd like to add to that. I mean, we're talking about in regards to the drug treatment courts. We have to remember part of this bill includes mandatory prison time for growing 6 cannabis plants. And this is something that people might not qualify for the drug treatment court. For most of them, you have to fall under a definition of addiction. And for someone growing 6 cannabis plants for their own use and for sharing with friends or their community, this is something we have to wonder. We're putting people towards clogging up those systems and creating the same problems we have in the current system and those systems soon. And on the Texas piece, I think it's important to remember that it's not only Texas, but a lot of states across the U.S. and a lot of other jurisdictions around the world that are getting away from this enforcement-driven mindset, and that this is, we can either police or fight our way out of the issues our societies face with drugs. And also along with mandatory minimums, part of the bill talks about incarcerating people for trafficking in areas where young people frequent. And this is modeled off of U.S. drug-free school zone policies. And this is something that evidence has shown to fail, and it's something that states are now moving away from. New Jersey, for instance, recently abandoned their drug-free school zone policy because they found it not only ineffective, but damaging to the communities, and particularly minority communities in those areas.
There's also a disconnect between, like, when a judge sentences a person to a federal sentence, and the inability or he'll say that you also must seek drug treatment. But the judges don't have that power within the federal system. Like, you're at the mercy of basically of CSC and getting to a place that has a treatment program, which most prisons treatment programs are ridiculous. And I guess one thing about this bill too that hasn't really been mentioned, and it goes along with drug addiction, is concurrent disorders. A lot of the prisoners going in have mental health issues, and this bill does not deal with that at all. And what is going on with our mental health act within Canada, and how we deal with those type of prisoners within the prison system, and also they connect for when they are released back out into society, that having a release plan. And the inability for a lot of prisons, I know the SAN has actually worked on it with some institutions, but, and also with, and I mean across Canada too, but provincial institutions are disconnected from that. And, you know, like, the provincial systems are going to be overloaded, and then that again will take away money from other areas, healthcare, education, and whatnot, because of this new bill.
We have a couple of questions now that address some of the issues that you raised earlier, Krista. And I'll group them together a little bit. It's, will the impact of the Gladue ruling be explicit or implicit? And can Krista say more about the consequences for alternative sentences in Aboriginal courts? And connected with that is, to Krista, will this proposed legislation negatively affect the special treatment now received by some Indigenous offenders in the healing lodges?
And I guess I'll repeat a little bit and maybe clarify a bit about what Gladue does, which is it doesn't grant special rights or special treatment to Aboriginal people, but rather says we have to consider context, because violence and crime does not happen in a vacuum, right? It happens in our lives, it happens in our communities, and we need to understand where that behavior comes from. And so Gladue basically says that there's some really historic, very fundamental problems with the way that the government of Canada has imposed itself on our communities that need to be considered if there's to be any, you know, rehabilitation or restoration of the wrongs that have been done on either side. So I think what we're seeing with this bill is that with mandatory minimums, Gladue won't, like, I'm not sure that it will even be able to be applied. And that's a serious issue. Like, that was the Supreme Court of Canada ruling that said this is what judges must do. They must have that ability to look at context, look at historic and current injustices, and that's just being wiped away. And I think that's an infringement on our human rights. It's an infringement on our, you know, constitutionally protected rights as Aboriginal people. It's not about special treatment. And I have to say too, it's difficult when we have these conversations because we talk about bills individually. Whereas for Aboriginal people, I mean, our laws and our lives are basically guided by law and policy for our entire lives from the time we were born. And so we're kind of put on this trajectory, on this path of, you know, always having interactions with the criminal justice system, whether it be with child and family services, whether it be with kind of youth injustice kind of interactions, and then kind of once we get into adulthood, having that follow us, and it's just not, it really puts us on a path very, very early on that we've already said, like, there are reasons why, you know, our communities are working through these things, and there are reasons why we have restorative justice programs and healing and things that we've been working on for a very long time, and they're effective, and we've been saying this over and over and over again, and we need to understand that this law is going to intersect with a lot of other law and policies that right now shape our lives and communities.
I'm not sure quite who wants to tackle this, but it's a bit of an offshoot from that. And the question is, are there any studies or reports based in Canada on the effects this legislation will have on minors when their sentences are mandatory, on young people? Eugene, do you want to tackle that?
I'm not sure it will introduce mandatory minimum penalties for young offenders because they're dealt with under a different system. Tricia, have you moved that at all? I'm more concerned. I mean, this law will be applied most directly against people over the age of 18. The young offenders legislation in Canada has a different set of rules, and I haven't specifically looked at that because I've been so bamboozled by the current legislation. But I think we'll find a different set of rules. I don't think you're going to find a young offender being sentenced to 2 years mandatory minimum under this legislation.
Thank you. From how I understand it, actually, like there are pieces of the bill that are specifically targeting young offenders to, what was it, protect the public from out of control youth, which I think is very interesting wording. And it will, I think it will affect, especially when we're thinking about the rates of Aboriginal youth, particularly in child protective services, in detention, in custody, in foster care. These numbers are skyrocketing and getting higher and higher, more than the residential school system ever housed. And so when we're seeing, like that's what I was talking about, those intersections where this bill may not directly say Aboriginal youth, it may not directly say youth in general, but there are going to be amendments, I think, to the Youth Criminal Justice Act that are going to have an effect. So it's kind of a little backdoor approach. Steve, you
Yeah, the bill does include, I think it was previous Bill C4, which is the government always has the names. It's called Sebastian's Law, in case of Quebec. It does change the overriding principle of the YCGA, the Youth Criminal Justice Act, to protection of the public. It does bring in, I think, for the first time in the new system, concept of deterrence, specific deterrence for young people, which is a new concept. So I think what you know, right, doesn't have mandatory minimum penalties, but it does have certain provisions that are meant to, I guess, toughen up the YCGA. And I shared with this talk today as well about some new provisions about bail, making it tougher, easier for judges to keep young people in custody before a trial. So it certainly will have an implication for young people, although I think you're right, not the mandatory minimum penalties that adults will face.
Certain offenses, I'm just going to be brief, certain offenses now they can get adult sentences for, so that's part of the change in the new bill.
And all quickly is that, well, we won't have the direct effect. Indirectly, it's perpetuating this enforcement-driven system. It's keeping the balance of what our national anti-drug strategy well over 50% enforcement. It's keeping everything else, funding, just looking at effective strategies. It's keeping them at the minimal, and it's also perpetuating the stigmas and everything else that are promoted through this enforcement-driven policy, whether it's how we address young people in these settings that Krista was talking about, or it's how we address them when they become adults at 18 and suddenly eligible for federal things, and it's all part of a continuum of indirect effects.
We have a couple of questions now that kind of relate to the next step. And the first one, and I think I'll group the two of them together because they're requiring a little bit of legal lines in our panel here, as well as some general thoughts. The first one is, what are the steps that can be taken now by regular citizens to stop or reverse this? And what kind of legal challenges can be mounted against mandatory minimums? And is it possible that cases will be dropped or charges downgraded if there's not enough room in the prisons? Eugene.
Okay, how can we stop the process? Damn, we're trying. But it's really hard. This is an ideologically driven piece of legislation in many corners. It's very difficult. The evidence, does evidence bounce off? It bounces off. The ideology is like armor, and the evidence just bounces off the armor. What will work is if your members of parliament think that they risk losing the next election because of this. If they think that the public does not support what they're doing, they're not going to keep doing it because politicians want to get reelected. Legal challenges, yes. Legal challenges have been one of the few ways that we've had some successes with our drug laws. The Supreme Court of Canada decision 2 weeks ago that basically required the Minister of Health to grant an exemption allowing the supervised injection facility in Vancouver, Insight, to continue to operate legally is one example. There have been the successes we've had have been through court challenges, relying on the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, particularly the Section 7, the right to life, liberty, and security of the person, to challenge some of these laws that actually interfere with life, liberty, and security of the person. So legal challenges are going to be important. The mandatory minimums, I guess it's 25 years ago, the Supreme Court in 1987, I'm not an arithmetician, in 1987, the Supreme Court of Canada struck down the mandatory 7-year minimum penalty for importing narcotics into Canada under the old Narcotic Control Act. They did not say that all mandatory minimum penalties were violate the Charter. The government has tried to bring in these mandatory minimum penalties with 6-month, 9-month, 1-year, 2-year, 3-year terms. They're trying to get these mandatory minimum penalties under the constitutional radar, but they may not. People are going to, I mean, one of the first things we're going to have to do is take a case where there's somebody gets a mandatory minimum 3-year sentence and challenge it as being cruel and unusual treatment or punishment of Section 11 of the Charter, or as violating the right to life, liberty, and security of the person. So court challenges and get on to your MPs. Talk to them, let them know that this isn't the sort of Canada that you want.
Steve, can you address this from the victim's perspective as to what victims would like to see done to change this?
I should say, first of all, I don't speak on behalf of all victims. There were representatives there today testifying in support, so there's a bit of a division in the victims movement. The question of how to stop, I hate to be a bearer of bad news, but these guys got 4 years to the next election. They got the majority, and frankly, these are popular measures, right? Everyone in this room comes because of concern. The average person who's not familiar with this, who isn't watching CBC, National, 10 o'clock at night, shooting Texas story, these are popular measures. And there's so many different parts of this bill. Right? You might be opposed to the drug stuff, but who's going to argue against mandatory minimum penalty for child sex offenders? So it's a very popular process, and they have 4 years to the next election, and they ran on this. This was no secret. They promised during the election they were going to pass this bill in 100 days. And so they're going to do it. And it's the same message I delivered to some of my friends in the violence against women community about the gun registry, right? They're going to strip away the long gun registry, and there's not a whole lot we can do. Doesn't mean we just sit back and do nothing. You got to educate the public and your friends. But I think the reality is they're going to push ahead, and if we can get some amendments that maybe water down some sections, then whatever your concerns are, then do that. But it's really going to be a really hard battle. They control the Senate now, so there's not really much hope there either. And frankly, the opposition parties, I don't think it'll be very helpful. I think they're a little bit too quiet on this. And with regards to crowns and plea bargains, one of the things that I've tried to educate the government a little bit about, and our friends in the victims community, is that if you accept the notion that victims want offenders to be held accountable and given appropriate sentences, and people differ on what that actually means, this bill isn't going to help. The Crown Attorneys Association have come on numerous times and told Senate members and members of Parliament they can't handle the workload they have now. They can only prosecute 10% of cases that come before them. It means 90% of cases have to be dealt with by way of plea or stays. There's a situation in Quebec where the Crowns went on strike because they were just too overburdened. In British Columbia, cases are getting stayed all the time. So from a victim perspective, this bill actually is going to make the system give victims less sense of justice. Because Crowns are going to be forced, because you have mandatory minimum penalties, no one's going to plead guilty if they're going to go to jail for 3 years. We've taken away the 2-for-1 credit, so everybody wants their trials faster. Crowns have to actually give them those trials, or we're going to deal, or stay them because the delays are too long. And the reality is more cases will be plea bargained, more cases will be stayed, and whatever your perspective is, that's not a good justice system.
I wanted to respond to the first part of that question, which is like, as people, what are we going to do if and when this bill hits? And I think from our perspective, and from myself as somebody who definitely is not practically represented by MPs or MPPs or people in legislation and policy-making power, I don't feel represented by them, and I'm not. So where are we standing? We've been dealing with with this issue for a really long time. And it starts with, we call it kitchen table wisdom, which is sitting down with your community and your family and your friends and talking about reducing stigma for those who have experienced incarceration at any level, because there is so much stigma, and it absolutely prohibits and just has so many negative outcomes, simply because we believe the stuff. We believe the stigma, we believe the stereotypes, and so when you actually do the hard personal work of challenging that, and challenging that within your family and within your community, then we'll see that resistance to this kind of legislation will build from the grassroots up, right?
I think, as I mentioned earlier, I was talking about impact assessments, and I wish Brilliance was part of my day-to-day job, but it really came from the US, and they are currently doing impact racial statements before bills get passed into law. So policymakers have to forecast what's going to be the impact. And Iowa, of all places, was the first place to do so. We also do environmental forecast impacts. Why would we not do this in such a massive crime bill? I think that is one piece that we've put forward to the Justice Committee to ensure that there's a forecast impacts assessment on a variety of factors. And I think we do have the opportunity to ask Parliament to be responsible and do a proper assessment. Once the bill, once the bill is passed, then there should be a review. And I think that is the only sensible way to approach this bill, is to make sure that you have a sense of where you're going with this. In terms of what happens to kids, I think once a parent is incarcerated, you want to make sure that the child maintains a certain relationship with the parent. But it's not just about corrections or child protective services, but it's a collaboration between those two agencies in ensuring that when visitations are possible, making sure that the prison system, prison itself has proper visiting rooms. There's a variety of factors that need to be considered to ensure that the child maintains a relationship with the parent. And part of that is you don't want to traumatize the child either. If you separate the child completely, there will be long-term impacts, psychological. There's also a financial impact once you remove a parent. These parents are actually contributing to their household. Let's not fool ourselves. They are contributing members of our communities. So once you remove them, the child suffers as well. So I think the bottom line is we need to start showing what the collateral damages will be and hold the government accountable to make sure that they do take a look at what exactly is this bill going to do in the long run and on a wider scale.
And just a reminder that the bill hasn't passed yet. So I sort of a hopeful thing that, I mean, it is still very important that to write your MP or your MPP or your provincial politician or your municipal politician or, I mean, people that work with substance use issues in the area, and to keep, I mean, talking about it like Krista talked about it. But these things do pile up, and I mean, for us, for having the last 4 years in fighting this bill, it's been amazing to see, I mean, how rooms like this went from like 10 people to crowded churches, and to then have such a wide range of opinions being raised here about how negative this legislation is, and it's important to keep this up so that we can prevent future legislation, because I mean, if we do have 4 years, sensible drug policy isn't necessarily a political thing, and it doesn't have to be conservative or progressive or liberal or an NDP, and no party should own this, but what we're all part of doing is making it incredibly unpopular, both within the Conservative Party, but in politics, both at the federal, provincial, and municipal and community level, to make sure that this is something that we can have the position to undo these changes if they do go through in the future.
Our time is growing a little short now, and we did want to leave some opportunity for our guests to mingle with you over a cup of coffee and some refreshments I hope we've touched on most of your questions. There's probably a few. I mean, one of the big things we haven't really touched on, and there's been a lot of attention to, is the cost of all of this, you know, financially and economically, and maybe that's something that you can mull over with refreshments. I'd like to just give each of the panelists then, if they choose, perhaps a moment just to sum up a little bit and maybe leave you with some closing thoughts.
Thank you, Maria. First of all, thank you again for coming out to sort of try to help us think through these issues. My area has been drug policy for many, many years. I would like to see Canada start looking at treating drugs as a health and human rights issue. The criminal justice system is a very blunt instrument. It's not a very effective instrument. It causes tremendous harm in many quarters. We can address many of the problems that we face, the reasons why people use drugs, the type of drug use that occurs, the harm that occurs to others if people use drugs in certain circumstances. We can deal with that quite often outside the criminal justice system. We do not need to use this very blunt instrument to try to solve this problem. We've had 100 years of using the criminal law to deal with drugs in this country. It hasn't worked. It hasn't worked in the United States. It hasn't worked anywhere else in the world. We really need to move away from that punitive model and move more towards a helping model. Thank you.
I'd just like to thank the organizers for having me here and thank all of you for coming. My mother always said to always say something nice about somebody. So no one said it was about Stephen Harper yet. He's always been accused of He's always been accused of being very divisive, having very divisive politics. But I have to tell you, I think 5 or 6 years ago, you probably would have seen this group of people up here talking about an issue of concern. So he's actually a uniter, I think. He's united on different reasons. I mean, I'll be honest, I come at this from a crime victim's perspective. I've been working with victims for almost 20 years. And if I thought that there was something in this bill, and other than the provisions I talked about, which are really positive, but a very small part of the bill, if I thought that the mandatory minimum penalties for child sex offenders or tougher pardons or whatever the case may be, would actually cause fewer victims in the future, make the streets safer, or address the needs and concerns of the victims that we talk to every day, would help one woman who walked through our door was deciding whether she was going to leave her abuser or not, then frankly I wouldn't be here. But I don't see any evidence, I don't see anything in the bill that's going to help most of the people that we work with. And the challenge for us is that we're going to spend millions, billions of dollars, provincially and federally, on this. And it means we can't spend it on child absence centers. It means we can't spend it on affordable housing for women to leave those relationships. It means we can't spend it on a place for a child who's on the street wondering where they're going to sleep, if they're going to trade their bodies for a warm meal and a warm bed for a place to go. We can't spend the money in 2 places at once. And so the government makes this a priority, and I guess I would just ask them to look at the other priorities that exist.
Yes, I'd like to thank the organizers for having me here, and thank you for everybody for showing up. I would just like you to think about, and people that support this bill, think about the consequences of this bill. Not right now, but 5, 10 years in the future, where there's more crime, there's more victims, prisoners or ex-prisoners don't have hope of seeking good employment because they can't get a pardon for 10 years, or for a Category 1, I think it's 5 years it'll go up to for a Category 2. The cost is too high, you know. The burden that the provincial government's going to have to pick up from this bill is going to be astronomical. And that is going to impact other areas, as I said earlier, healthcare, education, infrastructure. It's going to get to the point where I believe that everybody in here will know 1 or 2 people that have been convicted of offense. I want you to understand what having no hope is really really like. It's demeaning, it's soul killing, and that's what I feel this bill is about. It's retributive, an eye for an eye, and we can't have a society like that. We need programming, we need to deal with people's issues before they get into prison. We need to deal with low-income housing, deal with the economy. If we deal with all these other issues, a bill like this would not be needed.
I really appreciate the reminder of, looking beyond just right now and thinking about we're all about the next 7 generations. And one thing also with the Native Sexual Health Network that we keep saying, keep reminding people, is that our communities and Aboriginal people specifically are over-policed, but underprotected. And what that actually means is that more police involvement in our lives and community does not mean more safety. That's just not how it works for us. And so with this bill in particular, I mean, given that we're the majority population in both federal and provincial institutions, we are never asked, we are never adequately consulted. We just aren't in mind, or, unless the idea is to put us all in prison, which we could talk about that possibility. And so it's really, I can't impress enough to say that there is so much damage this will do to the work that our communities have been doing for a very long time to try and address the injustices that we've been seeing and are currently seeing as a result of other bad law and policy.
I think the important piece that we need to remember is when someone is sentenced to prison, they're not sentenced to being exposed to HIV, Hep C, to the loss of family. I think those are important factors to keep in mind. I think the HIV prevalence with the federal population is 10 times higher than that in the general population. You look at provincial prisons, it ranges from 10 to 20. When you remove a person from society and it damages a child for life, that's a significant piece to take a look at. I think often we think, throw away the key, the problem is resolved. But as Greg mentioned earlier, everyone comes home eventually. It's interesting, the Bush administration back in 2000 something said, oh my, 600 ex-offenders coming to a neighborhood near you. Maybe we should do something about this. And so they started focusing on reentry programs. Now, I'm not opposed to that, but I think we have an opportunity to not take 30 years to realize that we can actually focus on the front end and ensure that people don't go in the first place. Because the collateral damages involved are so significant and the price tag is going to be scary at the end of the day that we don't need to spend the next 30 years figuring that piece out. Let's focus on the front end rather than on the re-entry. That's it, thanks.
Awesome. Again, thank you to the organizers who put in a ton of hard work into this event, and thank you for everyone coming out, and thank all of you for being so awesome. I'll try not to talk about the negative impacts. I mean, we're talking about the costs, and it's so important to remember that, we talk a lot about the financial costs, but it's human costs on people, on families, on communities, on people that will receive their education in prisons instead of somewhere they might actually choose to. But this is all to say change can happen, and it often happens very slowly. And I mean, drug policy reform has never been an easy process, or at least in my limited experience from having, the great leadership of folks from Eugene and learning about the history of it all. But that doesn't mean it won't happen, and that doesn't mean we're making steps towards that now, and even just coming out and being able to talk and, like it's been said, just meet a couple new people that you can promote these discussions with and take it back into wherever it is you go tonight or tomorrow or this weekend. And that's really, I mean, young people who are getting involved in this are pissed off and scared, but at the same time, we do know that we can make the change, and we will. So that's my hopeful point for the close.
My little green light is on. On behalf of the organizers, I'd like to first of all thank all of the panelists with us tonight. As Eugene and Steve and the others have said, this isn't perhaps the time when we're able to change anything, but I think if we go away from this evening with a better understanding and a better education as to what's involved in this bill, what the implications are, and as Caleb just said, share it with our friends and our neighbors. I think that's a service, a good public service that will be well served. And for that, we have to thank our panelists tonight, and I'd like to do that. Thank you very much. All of you, along with our panelists, please feel free to stay and mingle with a little bit of refreshments and cookies. Absolutely.
Did you get it all, Andrea?
Yes, I did.
Good.
I can't remember your name.
Oh, Chantal.
And